Hello, welcome everybody to the Spotlight series. You are tuned into Community Works Institute Spotlight series. Please visit us at communityworksinstitute.org, CWI for short. We bring the classroom to the community and the community to the classroom. Joe Brooks helps run the Community Works Institute institutes that happen throughout the year. For K through 16 educators, K through 20 educators also. And you can learn about equity justice work. You can learn about developing new curriculum. You can learn about how to have students do ethnography in their communities. There's a lot of good stuff for you to check out on the website and at the Institute. So communityworksinstitute.org. This is Father's Day. I am Zack Ritter. I work at Cal State Dominguez Hills as the Interim Associate Dean of Students, and I teach about social justice history. And we have Eric Ritter, who is my father. So it's a very auspicious day. And he taught me most of what I know about social justice and most of what I am passionate about today. He planted those seeds. So I figured it was only right to invite my father on the show today. So Eric Ritter, man, this is so surreal. Worlds are colliding. Okay, so just real brief, and then we'll get into some questions. So tell the viewers, because there's like, K through 16 educators in the session. Who is Eric Ritter and what is he about?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invite to you and Joe, and glad to be here on Father's Day, which seems like as good a day as any. I'm Eric Ritter. I'm in my 74th year, and I'm a happy LA resident since I was 9 years old. And this city has been my classroom, if you will. So I've always taken my cues from the city, and that led me into a kind of circuitous way of, I studied at UCLA. I grew up in, those of you who know LA, I grew up in the Crenshaw district. My parents were European refugees, survivors from the concentration camps. I myself was born in Germany, and so I spent my career in city government, and I'm happily married to Nancy Fine, who is the mother of this gentleman, and that's about as succinct and probably accurate a mini biography as I'm going to give you.
I love it. I love it. So I'll bounce around here, but I just came from Dorsey High School, where you went to high school, as well as Hamilton. I was playing tennis with my friends, and I was imagining you as a kid, because I was playing tennis, and there's about, I don't know, 15 tennis courts, and they were quite racially diverse, right? And you always taught me about how racially segregated LA is, which it is, and class segregated. But what was it like? What was it like growing up on Santa Barbara, near Santa Barbara Boulevard, which is now Martin Luther King, and Rodeo, which is now Obama Boulevard? What was it like growing up around there?
Well, number one, it was Santa Barbara Avenue, just to keep the geography straight. I lived with, obviously with my folks. This was where we first came to LA. I was 9 years old. And it was quite an eye-opener for me, because my first formative years had been as a young child in Germany. And then when we came to the States, we lived in a town in Western Illinois on the Mississippi River. So it was pretty rural. So LA was a big culture shock. The neighborhood we lived in at the time, this is in the late 50s, was predominantly white, but the schools were my elementary school was about half Japanese American, so that was culture shock for me. And there were some black kids and some white kids, but it was predominantly Japanese American. Junior high school was Audubon, and I went to Dorsey in the 10th grade. By then, I'd say the demographics was about half white and half Japanese American and half black. And though it wasn't kumbaya time, we did get along well. And so that was a good experience for me. Yes, LA is a segregated city, but surprisingly, I had my first taste of LA, my first, what, 8 years, 9 years. It was quite diverse. And, my dad has his businesses in downtown LA. And so that was heavily in that part of town, Hispanic. And my dad was a grocery man. And at a young age, it was my job to come and sort beer bottles and Coke bottles on Saturday and Sunday. And and for pay, I got to sneak candy bars. And my dad, who was an Austrian Viennese Jew, was very comfortable with the different folks in the neighborhood. And I remember a lot of the Hispanic guys came up from Mexico and they'd work on the railroads and other jobs and factories. And my dad picked up a kind of pidgin Spanish. And so he was selling tortillas, manteca, huevos rancheros, huevos, tomates, todo como así. And so it was interesting. It was real comfortable. But I won't, fantasize about it or gloss it over, but it was good. Everybody tried, and I learned a lot just hanging around with my dad and in the neighborhood.
Mm, mm. So, all right. So it's Father's Day. So you might be thinking about your own father. So you and I went to where he was born in and lived
In Vienna.
Vienna.
All right.
You seem to have because you're a city planner and you were a teacher at Jefferson High School for a while. You have a knack for figuring out the geography of the city, not only like, where's the subway, where's the buses, but also the human geography of what neighborhood is this and where's the museums and blah, 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 blah. So when you took that must have been surreal taking your family to Vienna and thinking about we went where your father grew up and we went to where the Prater is and now it's an Ethiopian neighborhood. What were you thinking when you were in Vienna? And what did it give you insight into your own father?
Well, we were, as I'm sure some of your audience, we were immigrants, and it was a nuclear family, and we really relied on each other. I'm talking about my dad, my mom, myself being the older son, and then my younger sister. And so a lot of the cultural stuff came from my folks. And though my dad got pretty acculturated in America quickly, there always was this deep connection with Vienna. And so I'd heard stories from when I was a child. Those were the stories, that I got from my dad. And so it was both a culture shock and at the same time somewhat vaguely familiar. So when we found where he lived near the Prater, for those of you who don't know, that's a huge amusement park in northern Vienna. If you've seen the movie The Third Man, where Orson Welles is going to throw Joseph Cotton out of the big Ferris wheel, that was my dad's neighborhood, and it was really right behind his apartment. And so, the Blue Danube, which is not very blue, was right there, and the Stevens Dome, the big cathedral, was nearby, and so it seemed familiar, and yet, to be perfectly honest, the break that fascism and Nazism brought to our family was still palpable to me, which once had been the center of, not that my father's family was very religious, but they were identified Jewish, and the area they lived in was called Leopoldstadt, which was the Jewish part of town. And, all that's gone, you'd be hard pressed to find any of that. So that kind of, I don't know, urban evolution, I've always kind of found interesting. And I found it interesting in LA when I got to know LA, and I would troop around Boyle Heights or downtown LA or South Central, which when I was a kid was just called Central LA, and Central Avenue and so forth, to get a feel of, the history of the place and so forth. So that's always been kind of in my DNA, I guess.
Mm, mm.
And
So
I've always thought it's important for people to know where they live, understand the history, the good and the bad, the developmental history, making money in real estate and stuff like that, as neighborhoods change, evolve. But cities are, as I've often told you, are not static. I mean, we can say, oh yeah, my family's lived in this neighborhood for 40 years and so forth. But 40 years down the road, none of your folks might be there. It might be a whole different scene. So, it's transitory. It's an organic place. It grows, it thrives, and then it maybe dies down and becomes something undesirable, and then it comes back again. That's the wonder of cities, and particularly our own city of Los Angeles.
mm, mm. So I want to get into like Lewis Mumford and some of the city planning that you did in LA. But first, I think you touched upon it. I mean, I guess the kind of the elephant in the room. So what was it like growing up as the son of two Holocaust survivors?
Whoa, that's a big question. I guess a lot of the trajectory of my life is based on the choice that my mother, especially, and also my father, made soon after I was born. My father, who had, obviously was founded in the German Austrian culture, was comfortable living in post-war Germany, and they were living at the time. Just a quick, historical thing. Germany was split up into 4 military zones: Russian, French, British, and American. And my folks met in the American zone, which was basically southeastern Germany, Bavaria, and the states around Bavaria. And so my mother did not want to stay in what she felt was still a very Nazi influenced country, even though the Americans were there. And so she pushed my father to make the choice. And so they talked about Argentina, England, America, Israel. There was no Israel then, it was Palestine. And the choice was to leave. And so they made the choice. And the first one that came up as a viable option was the United States. And through the Joint Distribution Committee, which was a kind of social service organization, not a kind of, is a social service organization, they found a sponsor to bring them to America. And this was a synagogue in Western Illinois in the town of Rock Island, who sponsored us. And so that whole episode, I'm making this longer than it should be, colored my childhood. This whole thing of my parents breaking away from their past in some ways, though my mother would often talk about her experiences in the Nazi occupation of Poland. My mother was Polish, and then both of them were teenage concentration inmates. They did not know each other. They would meet after the war in at a Hanukkah party in Bavaria. And so this was, our history. I didn't know it was unique until much later. And so the choice of moving to the States, making that cultural break was always very predominant. And it was both an easy thing and a hard thing. They were young, but they didn't know the culture. They didn't have any family. And so it made for the nuclear family being very important. And so because my parents were very young, I almost was a participant in the threesome when they were making decisions and stuff like that.
Mm.
I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, you have. I mean, I think that's, I've talked to some of my other friends who are immigrants themselves, and that threesome notion of them having to do the taxes or them having to do the conversations in the translation in English for their parents is a common theme, and it makes people, I would assume, grow up faster than normal.
Right.
We are in a moment, I want to get into Rock Island a little bit. We're in a moment of, I guess, for some folks, racial reckoning. And we're talking about the ghosts of the past and digging up the past. And, I was watching a show about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they literally just dug up 18 bodies of Black folks that were murdered there in 1921 during the Black Wall Street race massacre. You grew up in Illinois near a cemetery, and I think there's some interesting symbology of, you were talking about, this guy would, I guess the Undertaker or whatever, would get drunk and do a dance on the graves and stuff like that.
God, you were listening to all my stories.
Always. And but I'm paralleling that with what your mother Paula would say about all these people in her own family that as a child you thought were still alive, but they were actually the ghosts. So speak a little bit about that, and also just for an immigrant kid talking about space-based learning, what did Rock Island, Illinois was your first introduction? Because I guess you went through Ellis Island and did all the stuff we learned in the textbook. This is your first introduction to America and Midwest, life, and you are put as the German club president, right? As a kid. So tell us a little bit about that.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack. This is, we have to put it in the context. This is the early 1950s. My mother doesn't know very much English. As I said, we were sponsored by this Jewish synagogue in Rock Island, and called the Tri-City Jewish Center. And they helped us find housing at the edge of Rock Island near property they owned, which was adjacent to probably the only Jewish cemetery between Chicago and Des Moines, Iowa. And so as children, there were three of us, and we would basically go walk through the cemetery and not really understanding it. And the gentleman you're talking to was a grave digger, and he was a farmer, and his wife was a good Baptist lady, because later she would give us a Bible and also wonderful apple pies and try to show us the light that she felt we could reach joining her denomination. And she was a great woman, Mrs. Johnson. But Mr. Johnson did like a little, as we would say it back in the old days, a snort. And he would do a little jig for us every time he finished, uh, digging a grave. And, we were kids, little kids, and we thought that was great. Uh, where am I going with this? The connection, because my mother, this was before, she didn't have the language. She didn't know very many people. We were at the edge of town. Uh, ultimately, my dad would buy a car, but we only had one car. So she was stuck with me. And then my sister was born about almost 3 years after we got to the States. And so she had this baby. So especially in the Illinois winters, she would talk to us about her family that she had lost. And for her, they were very real. She was one of 5 sisters of a rather apparently well-off Hasidic textile merchant in southern Poland. If any of your listeners know Polish geography, near the city of Krakow. And she would talk about them. And for me, until I guess I was about 6, they were very real because they were real for her. And then one day I kind of made the connection between the people up the road who were buried in the cemetery and the people my mother was talking about, who I would never meet or have the pleasure of meeting. But in some ways, I knew something about them. And so this was, in my mind, I call it the talk, and so that was the connection, and I guess for a lot of, hopefully a lot of immigrants, they don't have that talk about death, but you do have talk about who was left behind, and parents and grandparents that, on the American side, maybe you don't get to meet. I have a certain empathy for that, what you've given up, that you don't even know.
Did she ever open up to you and talk about what, like, the pain she was going through?
That would come later when I was older, and I would, we would talk frankly as adults. But as a child, it was more stories about her childhood, and and some of her childhood obviously was during the war. But until she was separated from her parents and her sisters, no, she didn't talk about that.
Mm, mm,
Not then.
mm. What was it like? You changed your name because you didn't like people calling you Eric. 'Cause
Gosh.
in school they couldn't get your name right? Because it was Erich. Um,
My name in German is Erich, Erich. And for English speaking Americans, that's a tough one. So it was Erich or Erk or all kinds of variations in between. And I guess when I was in the 2nd grade, I and had started learning how to write my name, I decided I was going to drop the H. And I never asked anybody, and I just did it. And and I'm really impressed with you that you remember this tiny story. On Father's Day, I'm very impressed and gratified that one of my sons actually listened to my stories.
of course, of course. Well, I was just watching Minari, and there's this Korean family that's in
Arkansas.
Arkansas, right? And there's just such a culture clash, and we don't think as about white folks as being immigrants or the last, like, Jewish wave. So was it weird at school? Did people treat you well? What was the deal?
Well, at my elementary school, it was a two-pronged thing. There was still an element of, I guess earlier in the century, there'd been immigrants from Germany, And so some of the teachers had a fond recollection of the German language, and they found me and a couple other kids, immigrant kids, and they started a German club, which was weird. But now that I think about it, but anyhow, so on the one hand, we spoke a little German at school, and on the other hand, to be honest, I really wanted to be like the other kids, an American, and a lot of my culturation was TV was new then, and so one of the first things my dad, after he started making a little money, was he bought a TV, and that helped me to understand, you know, Howdy Doody and Pinky Lee and names of shows that no longer exist. Helped me understand the cadence of the English language. For a while, it was difficult for me, but and the other thing was my dad was very good with languages, and in Germany he had worked somewhat for the U.S. military, doing odd jobs, and so he picked up some English. And once he came to the States, he kind of kicked into high gear and just picked it up right away.
Mm.
So by the time I was 8 years old, we were pretty much speaking English. Except when my mother got upset with me, and then she would kick into her Polish Yiddish and let me have it.
So there's this intense desire to become real American, quote unquote, whatever that means. And you would say that you would see this behavior exhibited also with Japanese American students at Dorsey, the desire to want to fit into, I don't know, white Anglo America. You had a conversation, well, I don't know, with your parents that you said, we're only going to speak English in this house now. How did that go?
Actually, it was more like my mother would sometimes come to the elementary school to pick me up, and she would speak Yiddish to me. And one day as children can often be, I was not kind, and I said, I don't want to speak Yiddish anymore. I want you to speak English. And that was a kind of shock for her. I remember seeing her face. And on the other hand, she did start going to night school, and she when they could, after 5 years, they became citizens right away. So I think she got the message, not necessarily from me, but just that this was the environment. This was the 1950s, you have to understand. And, being, talking German or talking Polish was not exactly the best way to make friends and influence people. I mean, there was a strong, still, a lot of folks, the warriors were just behind them, and a lot of people had been in combat and stuff like that. And then the other thing was that Eastern Europe was thought of as communist, which it was definitely occupied by the Soviet Union, though my mother was the furthest thing from a communist, quite bourgeois. And she she definitely became a citizen after 5 years. She pushed my dad, and I remember that was a big learning experience in our house, that she would read the Constitution to him, and I, as an 8-year-old kid, would listen, and I didn't know what it was about, but I knew it was serious. And she talked about senators and congressmen, and the 10 amendments to the Constitution. She memorized them, the Bill of Rights. And so this was a learning experience for me through my parents, who were very diligent about becoming American citizens and very serious.
Mm. Mm. So yeah, growing up in your household, understanding the Constitution and understanding the promise of what America could be was very much so a big deal. And I wanted to be like a politician. I wanted to be a lawyer or something like this. But also in your education and curricula, I learned a lot about you because there's also kind of a radical side of you where growing up, I think in college, you went to UCLA and apparently, as you said, you paid like $60 a semester, which I'm like, whoa, that's wild. Um, you taught me about, I guess what you would call the Chicano movement or like a Latinx, like East LA walkouts. You taught me about the Black Panthers. You taught me about a lot of liberation struggles, and I think you learned you were very diligent about learning Jewish history from a liberatory lens. Tell us about like what, and you went to a lot of political rallies. You were very anti-war. You were driving around a senator's daughter. Like, tell us about your political awakening as a college student and beyond. You worked in Cleveland, in AmeriCorps. You worked in Vegas in Teacher Corps. So tell us about that awakening for you.
Well, you know, I was very conscious of what had happened to my parents. You know, that was very real to me. I mean, both of them had Auschwitz tattoos on their forearms. So it was not, you know, that far away. And they were always talking about, in Yiddish, it was, you know, the word Holocaust did not exist at the time for me, but they used the word Horben, which was the Yiddish word for a huge trauma, a huge tragedy. And that was a common word. And so I knew something really horrific had happened. And as I got somewhat older, I mean, you know, a kid knows right away, I don't have cousins, I don't have aunts, I don't have grandparents. And so I connected the dots. And also just to not overdo it, but the whole story of Passover and the Exodus story was also always a big image in my mind. And so I connected that my parents had been slaves and the idea of being slaves in Egypt. And then when I started as a child, there was an arsenal, an old Civil War arsenal in Rock Island that had been used by the Army in the Civil War. And I kind of made the connection that, you know, Black people had been slaves. And so that really, that whole, in a childlike way, was very strong in my head. And when I heard about Martin Luther King when I was in UCLA, that his whole persona and his whole effort for bringing about racial justice for his people and voting rights for his people resonated with me. And then I had the opportunity when I was 18 years old of actually hearing Martin Luther King in person at Hollywood Temple Israel, which was then run by Rabbi Max Nussbaum, who had had to leave Germany because of the Nazi subjugation of the Jews. And so those kind of connections, and also, frankly, the kids, the Japanese American kids who I went to elementary school and junior high school with, and I would hear their stories, and I would hear that some of their parents had been in, you know, what I thought were concentration camps. And so that connected with me also. And so that kind of sense that, you know, not everybody's got it good, and you know, the idea of liberation and freedom is not just an abstract, but can be taken away from you, can be worse than that. Awful things can happen, you know, as in as I later would understand the Jewish genocide. And so that coupled with, taking it up to UCLA. I got to UCLA in '65, which was the beginning of the Vietnam increase of American presence there. And early on, I just had a bad feeling about it. And I would we had teach-ins at UCLA, and they would talk about different aspects of the Vietnamese struggle. And I educated myself. I read Bernard Fall, who had been a French journalist who had written about the French Indochina debacle. And it just seemed like the United States was going in the same direction. And and I and then, it started hitting my generation, where some of my friends were being drafted, and some of us who had um, deferments would have to go at UCLA every 3 months to our draft board and show them evidence that we were there. And a lot of kids couldn't handle that. And several of the kids who I knew from school just joined up because they just, either they felt it was their obligation, but also they figured that there was no future in staying at UCLA. So they joined up.
So you had some friends that died in the Vietnam War, right? And then some that came back and were very messed up. Is that right?
One of the kids who I went to elementary school and junior high school would die at 19 in Vietnam. Richard Kittner, Dickie. Yeah, yeah. I knew some other guys who served, but he was the one person I knew who was unfortunately killed in action. And that was a profound thing also. Not that we were the closest of friends, but we were friends. And he was a good kid, and it was sad. And then a couple of the guys who I knew who had signed up had a rough tour in Vietnam. So they would tell me about that. And, you know, they weren't sure what we were accomplishing. And so um, it was a rough time for my generation. Some of the guys felt very patriotic and went, and some of them came back kind of messed up. And then some of them went and didn't believe in it from the beginning. You know, it was we were teenagers. What do we know? What did we know about Vietnam? Who had ever really paid any attention? And ironically, a couple of years later, the Vietnamese would have a border war with what we call then Red China. So the whole idea of the Red Chinese having all this influence in Vietnam was, I don't know,
Hmm. Hmm.
didn't resonate.
You spent time in Cleveland doing AmeriCorps, and you said that you spent a week with Cesar Chavez. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, back then it was called VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. So it was the kind of domestic Peace Corps. And when I graduated, I just figured I wanted to do something. I didn't want to go to grad school. I didn't want to hassle the draft board. I figured, what will be, will be. And so I needed an adventure. I wanted to get away from my parents. I wanted to do something. And so I checked around with Peace Corps, and I checked around with, and I've heard about this Vista. And so I applied to Vista and I got accepted, and I was hoping they'd send me to New York, but they said they were going to send me to Chicago. And then when I got the ticket, it said Cleveland. So I said to myself, well, I guess I'm going to Cleveland. So I went to Cleveland, and they set me up at a large Victorian house owned by a Episcopalian minister who was quite a character in himself, the Reverend Bob Burton. And Bob Burton had been an old Navy hand, and then he had found religion and did missionary work for the Episcopal Church. And they sent him to Cleveland, and he would like I said, this was a large Victorian house he owned, and he would give space to different people. And Cesar Chavez, who I had heard of in California, came to Cleveland for a week to really push the grape boycott in northeastern Ohio. And so I got to meet him, and that was a very informative and interesting experience.
So what was he like?
What was he like? Very taciturn, very quiet, very kind. Had a real interesting retinue of guys with him, also organizers, and they would just every day get up religiously, get in their cars and drive all over northeastern Ohio to the suburbs and greater part of Cleveland, and talk to people about boycotting grapes and helping them organize farm workers. And there were farm workers in Ohio too who needed organizing. He went out to speak to them, and a lot of them, I'd been assigned to a Puerto Rican community group there because I was one of the few kids who actually could speak a little Spanish. And so a lot of the farm workers were Puerto Rican. And so that was what Cesar and his group did. And they also, I was not part of this, but I heard it from him that they would talk to ministers and some politicians about trying to push the grape boycott.
Hmm. Hmm. You also met Russell Means in Cleveland, is that right?
That is true. My goodness.
I listen sometimes.
You sure did. I applaud you. My God. Yeah, Russell Means was a Job Corps organizer at the time, and he worked with the Reverend Bob Burton, and there were Native American indigenous folks. He, I believe, was from the Lakota Sioux people, and a lot of them come to Cleveland to get work in. At the time, there were still quite a few auto factories, and Cleveland at the time was kind of the secondary factory for auto parts for Detroit, and a lot of them got jobs there. And there were still some steel mills in the flats along Lake Erie, and so they got work there. And Russell would help their kids and help them find employment and also places to live. And yeah, he was a very colorful character.
You also had an encounter with Malana Karenga, or I guess as you knew him back then, Ron Karenga in Los Angeles.
That yes, I did. Well, that's prior. That was after the Watts riots. We had a program of tutoring. A bunch of us do-gooder kiddies would go down to Watts on a UCLA bus, and what was then, I don't know if it still exists, the Westminster Community Center on Success Avenue and down in Watts. And we would tutor kids and stick around. And then one day, Ron Karenga and some of his guys showed up and gave us the what for talk about what are we guys doing here? And it was interesting. Yeah, he was quite at the time, he was quite vocal and scared the bejesus out of us.
Did you guys go back?
Yeah, we went back. Yeah. Okay. But he told us, what are you guys doing down here?
So, I mean, you've seen LA go through a lot of transformations. You were here for the 65 uprisings. You were here for the 92 uprisings. And you were here for George Floyd with the BLM racial reckoning. I mean, maybe it's a silly question. Have we made progress? Okay, in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But from your vantage point, how have you seen, as a city planner, we should get into that as well. How have you seen LA grow and change?
Well, just from the personal level, let me say that my introduction to any kind of politics was when I was in high school. There was a kid at school called Michael Berman, who was the brother of future Congressman Howard Berman. And Michael got me to understand the Rumford Fair Housing Act and the push to rescind it, which was called State Proposition 14. And we were for, yes on 14, and the no people won huge. Anyhow, so we would go to, Michael would get the materials and we would go hand them out at markets. And this was my initiation. And one day a bunch of these individuals did not like our literature, these white gentlemen, and they wanted to take away our literature and physically. And we had a run for it, as I recall. And fortunately, I was a lot younger then. I was, 15, 16, and I could really, when I had to, put on a little speed. And so we had a run for it. So that was initiation for me, that not everybody will like your politics. And just because you think you're a do-gooder doesn't mean everybody else thinks you're swell. So that was interesting. I have to put it in the context. I worked on the Tom Bradley first campaign in 68, 69. And Tom Bradley did not win that campaign against our mayor, Sam Yorty, at the time. And I got to, I met quite a few people in those days. And that was kind of a more sophisticated initiation for me. And I kind of liked the idea of community political organizing. And I would then do that for Gene McCarthy and George McGovern. And we would walk precincts and talk to people and knock on people's doors. And people would, in those days, actually open up their door and talk to you. And even though when they didn't agree with you, they'd hear you out. I don't know what it'd be like now, but it was a real education. And so I got to go to different parts of town, East LA, South LA, the Valley. And that was an eye opener for me. I think that gave me a taste of the city as being a complex, organic entity of different peoples, different neighborhoods, different situations, different economic groups. And so that got me interested in urban planning.
Why did you like Lewis Mumford so much and this notion of urban planning?
Lewis Mumford, for those of you who don't know him, was a urban critic who worked for the New Yorker magazine for probably half a century, wrote dozens of books. And I found one of his books early on when I was an undergraduate, the history of cities or something like that, or the city in history. And I was just fascinated. I just thought that was the most incredible thing. He went through the genesis of urbanization, going back from prehistoric times through Middle Ages, Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of agrarianism, and the need for urban sites to sell products and stuff like that. So all of this was like, eye-opening for me. And so I became an adherent, a disciple of Lewis Mumford.
You had an idea of
See,
gardening.
that's what happens when you read a book sometimes. It can change your life. So beware.
What was his idea with garden cities?
Well, he was a man. He was born in the 1890s. So his maturation was in the 1920s and 30s. And he he grew up in Manhattan, and he thought a lot of old New York was being destroyed by too much urbanization. And he was for a certain kind of city of maybe 500,000 people that would be close to suburban and even rural areas. And so he fell for the idea of garden cities, which was a movement that took hold in the United States. I think it first generated in Great Britain and was very strong on Long Island. And so this was medium-sized cities with a whole series of businesses and opportunities where people could live and work instead of spending long hours commuting. He was not a great fan of subways. And ultimately, he would leave Manhattan and move to upstate New York. So that was his theory, part of which I embraced and part of which I did not.
We have some teachers on the call. What was it like being a teacher? And then shortly thereafter, you worked for the city, I guess, with the Consumer Protection Agency, right?
Yeah. Well, when I was at UCLA and also after coming out of Vista, I kind of decided I wanted to be a teacher. I'd been around a lot of teachers in Cleveland and I really admired them. And I thought they did good works. And so I came back to LA, excuse me, and I was working on a credential. And at the same time, I was a TA in the Culver City schools, a teaching assistant, and that went really well for me. And so I then I was working on my credential and my master's degree, and I decided I wanted to do it quickly, and I found Cal State LA was on the 4-quarter system, and UCLA at that time had left the quarter system and gone back to the semester. And I just was a young man I just wanted to get moving. So I started taking education courses out there, which of course changed my life since I also became a teaching assistant at Garfield High School, and there would meet my future wife. And so that was fortuitous. Anyhow, I did do some elementary school teaching before all this in Las Vegas through the teacher corps. And then when I got my secondary credential, I did some teaching at LA City Unified at Jefferson High.
And
I had gotten it, but in the interim, I had gotten a taste of, driving to graduate school one day, I heard on the radio that the city of LA had started a consumer protection agency, which no longer exists, regrettably. And I was a big fan at the time of Ralph Nader. And I said, oh, wow, that's got to be interesting. So I got myself, this was before the internet, so I got myself down to LA City personnel office. And they said, well, there's nothing open now. Fill this out and we'll maybe call you or write you if something opens up. And so a year goes by and I just forgot about it. And then they call me and they invited me for an interview. And I went for the interview and I got offered to be hired. And so I dropped out of grad school and I dropped out of teaching courses, and I went to the city of LA and was a consumer protection investigator for 3 years until we got written out of the budget because we were doing such a good job. And the business community was not happy with us because we were asking too many questions and really questioning a lot of auto finance contracts that a lot of folks on the east side were signing, and they would have balloon payments, that were outrageous. And in those days, not all the specifications in the contract were shown, and there certainly weren't bilingual contracts. So we unwound quite a few of them, but we
Hmm.
went by the way of all flesh. And doing that job, I got to meet some people from the LA City Council. And so when the consumer protection job folded, I got a job with the LA City Council.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
that's how that happened.
Yeah, we might have to have a part two because I know we're running out of time. But
Yeah.
and Joe was typing me that we should. He's so impressed with this conversation that he'd like to have a part two. So, it seems like you've always been searching for a way to make the biggest impact or kind of social change, and you kind of flirted with teaching as a way to make that social change, and then you worked for the city as a consumer protection agency, right? And then city planner, and you wanted to be a legal aid lawyer. And I think at one time you also wanted to be like a politician's behind the scenes guy making the policies. Looking back at some of the stuff that you've done, are there things that you are like, here are some of the wins, but I wish this could have happened differently for LA, or I wish I could have been part of a team to change this thing?
Wow, that's a big one. What I found, and I guess this is both a positive and a negative, government works very slowly, and that's a problem. But in some ways, government can be an agent and a facilitator of good. Um, it can provide funding for programs that didn't exist. Uh, you know, just in my small way, I helped the city get funding from the federal government to improve our wastewater systems. So, we all just kind of ignore the fact that we have running water, we have flushing toilets, we have electricity, um, we have streets that get potholes get fixed. We have police services, some of which are excellent and some of which aren't always excellent. But, to just say, we need a kind of recognition that these are the staples of modern urban life. And without them, we would be hard pressed and not have them. So I guess if I was to draw a bow around this whole conversation, it's important to try to get government to be an agent for positive change, to not be a negative. And it's important for the average citizen not to be disappointed and turned off by if it's not perfect, because it's not going to be perfect, because we're dealing with people at all levels. And sometimes they do wonderful things, and sometimes they're just lazy and don't do their job. So we got to call them out for that. But that's what democracy is about. If we all are participating and listening and active, I think we can make our government a positive thing and not a negative. That's, I don't
Yeah,
know if that answers your question.
no, it does. And I know we got to wrap up, but I think growing up as your kid, there's always this kind of fear and cloud that if we don't tend to our city, we don't tend to our classrooms, we don't tend to our government, that a slip back into fascism is ever imminent. And so I think I see a lot of your work as, I don't want to say preventing fascism, but in a low key, yes, and also getting people across class, across race, across gender, and across like government officials and the populace to talk and understand each other and actually create something beautiful in the city. I mean, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but it's been a very tumultuous past several years. I mean, do you feel like we're headed in a more productive direction, or are you concerned?
Well, I'm concerned. I mean, January the 6th was, remembering stories that my father told me about what happened in Vienna when the Nazis came in, and civil society just disappeared, and hooliganism, and then authoritarianism, and ultimately genocide replaced it. And anybody who spoke against it was dispatched and then jailed and then killed, sent to concentration camps. So it's not that long ago. And January 6th had a lot of hints of that. And I'd have to say I'm very concerned that people are not protecting their rights. Yes, it's important to have your right to be against something, but you have to be for something also. And just, the idea of taking down an officially elected president is just beyond me. And so I'm both optimistic with our present president and our present governor who've navigated, and our present mayor who've navigated us through this horrendous COVID experience, and partially we've come out the other side, and a lot of that is due to just good government. And some of it's been painful, and I understand that. And but just to have the opportunity of going forward and resurrecting a calmer society that gets things done is all, to my mind, all to the good. And I'm hoping that President Biden is successful with his infrastructure program, and also protecting voter rights. And families need money to get through a huge crisis. And so so far so good, but it's not written in stone that we're a success. So we all got to be vigilant, participate, and work to make things better for ourselves and our fellow citizens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, let's leave it with that. And I think, we got to have you back on the program and talk about some of your experiences in the classroom, and kind of your some of your experiences in City Hall and in education. I think there's a lot that we also have to cover. So let's put a pause on it. Dad, Eric Ritter, I appreciate you for being here today, and stick around a little bit after. We can talk to Joe for a minute. But for folks listening, thank you so much for tuning in to the Spotlight series. Remember, I, Zack Ritter, do the Sunday Spotlight series show. Joe Brooks does the Friday Spotlight series show. Community Works Institute is the nonprofit that Joe Brooks runs. CommunityWorksInstitute.org is the place you got to go to check out the institutes that are coming up. And we have in-person institutes hopefully coming soon. We also have virtual institutes, and these are spaces and places where you can learn about interesting conversations, intergenerational conversations like this, and also have professional development for your K through 16 educators and administrators about a range of topics. And I've presented at these institutes, and some of my colleagues have as well. So you'll like it. You'll like it, and hopefully your students will like it as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a beautiful Sunday. And thanks, Dad. This was cool, man.
My pleasure.